name is Javier, and I am a forester at Westwind, which is the forest management company in Muskoka and Parry Sound. And my presentation is going to capture what Westwind is about, but also Crown land forest management in Ontario in general, and some of the planning and the processes that go into that. So first off, minimize the screen here. So first off, a little bit about Westwind. So we are a community-based forest management company. We're non-for-profit, and we also have FSC certification. And as well, it's important to note that there are 8 Indigenous communities within or adjacent to the French Severn Forest, which is what in the forest community we call the Parry Sound Muskoka Forest area. We call it the French Severn Forest. And so these are the 8 different Indigenous communities within our forest, or that have an important association to the forest that we work in. And like I mentioned, we are FSC certified, I should say. And not only are we FSC certified, we were also the first large-scale forest in North America that was, certainly in Canada, that was certified in 2002, which is pretty great kudos to ourselves that we can give ourselves. So that's the Toronto Star article about Muskoka, aka the French Severn Forest certification with FSC, which we continue to this day. So back to a map of what we call the French Severn Forest, what can also be thought of as Parry Sound District and Muskoka District Forest. We have 1.3 million hectares. Our borders are the Georgian Bay on our west shore. Algonquin Park is our eastern border. And the reason we're called the French Severn is because it's roughly, well, the French River to the north, except for where it cuts across township lines, and then the Severn River to the south, except where it cuts through original township lines as well. So that is the extent of our forest, but within that 1.3 million hectares, there is actually 570,000 hectares of Crown land that we manage, and that can be netted down even further to 375,000 hectares of what is described as productive forest that we can go into harvest and manage sustainably. There's also 130,000 hectares of provincial parks and conservation reserves, all of this within that 1.3 million hectares. And something to note that I'll talk about later in the presentation is that 90% of our area that we harvest uses partial cutting systems, which are described as selection and shelterwood systems. And that is because of the types of forests that we have here in Muskoka. So instead of calling the French Severn Forest or Parry Sound Nipissing Forest, I'm just going to say Muskoka and really focus in on the Muskoka side. So we have 2 types of forests, and even within Muskoka as well. We have coniferous forest and deciduous forest, and certainly along the Georgian Bay shoreline, we have pine forests, and there are also pine forests within Muskoka, but primarily we have what are known as tolerant hardwood forests. So species of trees that grow together, can tolerate the shade of each other and grow at different ages and different age classes within the same patch of forest in what are considered tolerant hardwood forests. And on a broad scale, what we do at Westwind, it can be described under these 4 items at the bottom. We have areas of concern that we manage. We manage tree marking for harvest. We do oversight and compliance of all sorts of operations, whether it be harvest, renewal, or tending, and we also do lots and lots of monitoring of the forest to ensure that we're meeting our sustainability goals and objectives. So 2 very simple simplified examples of what areas of concern are and what they address is protecting values. So we have identified values within the forest, and as far as unique values, we have over 76 distinct values, and that can be low potential sensitivity streams, high potential sensitivity streams. It can be Cooper's hawk's nest, heronries. It can be a whole host of individual, very unique values, but we also have very generic values such as cavities created by woodpeckers, which are not necessarily being used by woodpeckers, and they certainly are spread across the forest, but those are also other types of values that we have. So 76 unique values is descriptive of the types of values that we can identify on the map spatially, and then there's also a whole host of other values that we address when we're planning and conducting forest operations. So these areas of concerns, what they do is they protect these values. They protect these values and ensure that whenever there's people working in and around the value, that value is protected, and that there is a continuation of that value into the future. So one example is maintaining residual forest reserves around water features. So this map shows a water feature, a lake and swamp marsh system that has just a red line drawn to it. And what that red line is actually used, we put an actual red line down on the ground with paint on trees to let operators know to not enter into those areas, or if they do enter into those areas, they have very strict guidelines as to how they can access trees in behind the red line. And another very specific value are nest trees. So we, as assessing a forest for harvest or renewal, we're walking around and we see these nests, these stick nests up in the tree. So the photo on the right is a yellow birch, and up high into the crown of that tree, you can see the stick nest. And that stick nest, it can be identified to a specific hawk, a specific bird, and we can then assess that value and give it the proper protection it needs. And then in doing so, we also identify the tree, and that's why there's a little blue N written on the stem of that tree to protect that tree when we're operating in the area, whether it's harvest, whether it's tending, whether it's tree planting. We want to make sure that we protect these values throughout all forest operations. The other aspect of the type of work that we do is tree marking. And this really, I say tree marking, and it encompasses a whole host of things. And it starts with a prescription. So we have tree markers that go out into the field with cans of paint, sometimes in snowshoes in the middle of the winter. But in order for them to go out there, they need to have a plan, direction that is given to them by a registered professional forester in the form of what's known as a forest operations prescription. And so this prescription details very specifically what types of trees to mark for harvest, what types of trees to mark for retention, and how to assess the different conditions within the forest and make those decisions on the ground on a tree by tree basis. So it's very specific direction to that specific parcel of forest that's given to the tree marker, so that they can go in there with their own knowledge and education and certification as certified tree markers and make those decisions on the ground with those directions that are specific to the forest that they're working in, not just directions to the forest in Muskoka in general, but very much to the actual plot of land that they're working in. And once the tree markers mark those trees for harvest, and the two photos I have here, that's exactly what the person is doing. She's marking orange around the tree for harvest, and then a stump mark at the base of the tree vertically so that once the tree's harvested, we can confirm that that tree was harvested, or we can confirm that that tree was supposed to be harvested, because we see the paint on the log at the landing, and then we also see the paint on the stump in the forest. So, and we assess that not just by looking at the paint, but we also do surveys. So we survey the area, we measure the metrics of the forest that's retained and the forest that's harvested, and make sure that once again meets the requirements of the forest operations prescription, so that if there are any errors or if there's any corrections that need to be made, they're made well in advance of anybody coming in with a chainsaw and cutting that tree down. So that auditing process is done by certified tree marking auditors, which are members of the staff at Westwind. So we do the quality assessment and quality control of the tree marking, as well as preparing the forest operations prescriptions for the actual tree marking and subsequent harvest. So once we have essentially the plan in place for a harvest of an area, then the work can be undertaken following the proper paperwork and authority given through the MNR, and we consider that oversight and compliance, which is the role that Westwind has at this point, where we are on site, speaking to the operator, speaking to the foreman, speaking to the truckers, the hauling the lumber and material, and making sure that they're following the requirements of our forest management plan. They're following the requirements of within the forest management plan that called the conditions on regular operations, and so we're in compliance with all of the legislation and requirements of harvesting timber on Crown land in Ontario. And we report that as certified compliance inspectors. We report that to the MNR through a forest operations inspections report. We report that to the district. We also work with the district very closely to inspect these operations together, and really get ahead of anything that could pose an issue, whether it be conditions deteriorating in the field and getting a little bit muddier later into the season, or not enough snow. So we want to make sure that everyone's very much aware of site conditions, and that work is undertaken properly, and then work stops when it needs to stop, and can resume when it can resume as well. So lots of oversight to make sure that operations remain in compliance. And finally, of these 4 general descriptions of what we do at Westwind is monitoring. So once the harvest is completed, we do go back to the area over subsequent years and make sure that forest is moving towards or is at the type of forest condition that we want to see based on the forest operations prescription that began the process in the first place. So with that's called silviculture effectiveness monitoring. It's described as free to grow condition for individual trees, and that's an older term. And basically, have we set this forest up to continue to grow and develop, and be the type of forest that we want it to be in 50, 100, 150 years. There's also other types of monitoring that we do. There's a photo of me assessing the regeneration trial of white pine that were planted in the Parry Sound district, and that was different species or different variations of white pine from all different parts of the province to see how individual varieties would do in our specific forest conditions. So, and then we also, in the photo on the top right, we do assess the growth and the age of trees using increment board. It's basically a little borer that cuts into the tree and extracts a tree core, and we can count the tree rings. Not just to age the tree, it's actually quite hard to age trees with an increment borer. It's possible and very much doable, but not easy. But more practical use of an increment borer to get out the core of a tree is to see how that growth has changed over time. Can you look back? You can easily look back using the tree rings to the last time the forest was harvested, or the time before that, or the time before that, and you can see how the growth of that individual tree has been affected either with the release given to it by the harvest or by natural disturbance like a fire, and also how that growth has been impacted, probably limited, as that forest has grown back in and competition has increased between individuals. And finally, monitoring of species at risk is undertaken by the MNR and MNR biologists, and we certainly work very closely with them to make sure that we protect those values and we operate appropriately around those values. And turtles being mobile and snakes being mobile, those values do change spatially on the map. And so we need to work on a case-by-case basis with them and our biologists to make sure that we're not impacting the habitat of these species at risk as well. So, knowing a little bit more about what we do at Westwind, I wanted to talk about the more higher level aspects of what we do, which is a forest management plan, which requires a lot of input from a whole host of different people, including the general public. So we have a great website online, westwind.ca, and we have lots of information about being involved in the forest management planning process. So if you go to our link there, you can find out what our forest management planning process is. And it's not a short process, much like an official plan for a municipality. It is a very long process which gathers information from a whole host of people and organizations, and it takes a length of time, more than 2.5 years from start to finish. We have a forest management plan in place now, started in 2019 to 2029, but it won't be too long, 2026, I believe, that when we'll start the process again for the next forest management plan. And it requires developing long-term management direction. Once we invite all possible participants that might be interested in participating, and that long-term management direction is in order to develop objectives and criteria that will lead our planning process so that we can manage our forest with a very long-term framework. So we have trees and forests that are long-lived species, long-lived ecosystems that change relatively slowly over time. So when we make plans, we have a planning horizon of 150 years. So the plan itself is 10 years in duration, but when we are making those long-term management directions and those that's spatial planning and modeling that we do, we are looking in a 150-year horizon. And so the multiple stages to the forest management planning process, and so by April 30th or April 1st, I should say, of 2019, our current forest management plan was approved. And that forest management plan begins with, at the highest level, the Crown Forest Sustainability Act, which directs the requirement to use the Forest Management Planning Manual, which has very specific direction for how that planning process is undertaken. And here's some photos showing that the actual cover of the planning manual on the right, which was updated in 2020. And because there is no great photo of the actual act, I put in a infographic made by Forest Ontario, I believe, talking about how Ontario's Crown Forest Sustainability Act ensures that forest values are considered during planning and also within operations, because the act, from a higher level down to very practical applicable levels, we have the Crown Forest Sustainability Act that directs the need to use the forest management planning manuals to ensure sustainability of Crown land forests. And that forest management planning manual has very specific directions for the planning process, but it also directs the use of specific guides in order to apply those sustainability principles at the practical operational level. And they're called guides. They really should be called mandatory texts or something of that nature, because they the use of their really requirements to use within them. So for example, the Forest Management Guide for Conserving Biodiversity at the stand and site scale, stand being a forest stand, so a parcel of forest. They have, for each individual value that we spoke about, 76 unique values within our forest management plan that are identified and so assessed. And so the information from this guide is put into our forest management plan. And those individual values are provided with standards that must be met within this guide to conserving biodiversity. They also have guidelines that also must be met, and they have each individual value best management practices that more than likely will be and should be met within the forest management plan. So there's not much deviation from what's required in these individual guides. Certainly the water crossing protocol is a key operational requirement within forest management, also one of the many guides. And the other major operational guide that's on the far left here, Forest Management Guide for the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence landscapes, that gives us a lot of the silvicultural direction that we use in our forest operations prescription. So lots of information that is taken into account, and all of it is put into our forest management plan, which is why our forest management plan itself is a PDF of over 1,000 pages, not including the additional documentation for long-term management direction, tables, and appendices. So it's a very, very large document with several tables and lots of specific direction, all derived from these guidelines from the guides and from the planning manual. And it's not a process that's taken on by a few people. There's lots and lots of people involved in developing a forest management plan. Here on the far left, I have the planning team members. So the planning team itself is fairly concise so that it can be productive, a task team. We have the plan author, project manager from the MNR, several members, including representatives from Indigenous communities, industry, and MNR biologists and MNR resource liaison specialists as well. And we also have the planning team advisors, so a whole host of other people that advise on different aspects of the plan throughout the process. We also have the local citizens committee members, which are a committee member that is representative of the different users of the forest, which continues on past the planning process as well. This committee continues to meet with the management forester at the MNR in order to make sure that their concerns and interests and values are continue to be addressed as the plan undergoes the full 10-year range. And then we also have plan reviewers from the MNR that assess our plan as well. So lots of people involved in developing and reviewing and preparing a plan for completion. So it's a big process, and finally, once we have it, it gets a really lovely front page, which covers off those two main forest types that we have, those coniferous pine forests and those tall and hardwood forests. And there's a cover page for our 2019 to 2029 forest management plan. And you can also now, even though we have the plan already in place, there are amendments to it occasionally as we go on, and that information, as well as the actual forest management plan and all the maps associated with it, are found for public access on the MNR's Natural Resource Information Portal. So you go there and click on forestry, and then brings up a map, and you can click our forest management unit number 360, which is the French Severn Forest, which is what we call the forest, the Crown Forest in Parry Sound and Muskoka districts. And from there, you can find out lots of information about the planning process. You can find out information about the different manuals and guides, but you can also get all that specific information about our forest and the forest management plan within our forest. This is a great overview map that we post on the NRIP website, and which is available for the public as well. And it highlights the French Severn Forest, the areas of Parry Sound and Muskoka that are within the French Severn Forest, and the harvest areas and tending areas that we have, as well as any new road constructions that we plan in the area. So as you can see, all the harvest areas are in a bright green color, and it's especially along the boundary with Algonquin Park. There's quite a bit of area, and it would probably be quite shocking if we were to use, for example, clear-cut harvest systems throughout all these areas, but that's not the case. We use lots of partial harvest systems because of the forest types, which is primarily tolerant hardwoods or pine-dominated forests throughout, especially along the Algonquin Park border. So we have these areas that are harvested, and it looks like a lot, but actually we go back to a lot of these areas every 20 years or so. So we can continue harvesting at very low volumes and intensity at such what in forestry would be considered very frequent scale of 20 to 30 years. And even closer look operationally down in the Muskoka area, on the image on the far left, we have Bracebridge, and on the top of the photo, there's Huntsville. So Batesville's roughly in the middle here, and any area that's in a dark color, that's private land, but any area that's white is Crown land, and any colored areas, those are forest areas that are being planned for harvest within the next 10-year period. So we have a few blocks, harvest blocks south of the Lake of Bays and east of Bracebridge, which are planned for harvest within this 10-year plan. So finally, another great cover from our website, which has lots of information as well, and I'll delve into a little bit here, is how is the timber harvested? And well, like I mentioned before, we have primarily partial harvest systems used in Muskoka. And you could roughly describe the harvest systems as three general types. You have selection harvest, so selection cut is on the photo here, and that little line shows you what that looks like if you were to be in a plane or in a drone looking down at the forest after it's been harvested. Very much almost a full canopy closure of the forest when it comes to a selection harvest. When it comes to a shelterwood harvest further down, now you can start to see the ground underneath, because there is a space between the canopies of the individual trees. And if you look closely, you can tell that if you have an eye for the crowns of trees, I should say. So selection harvest generally used on tolerant hardwood forests, although hemlock is also selection harvest. And these tolerant hardwood forests have these big fluffy circular crowns, and that's what you see where that area that's already been harvested is showing all of these big circular crowns. And where the area pointing to shelterwood cut, those are pointy or star-shaped crown, and those are pine trees. And so that's why the shelterwood cut is being used there, because it's the species and the ecology of that forest calls for that type of harvest system. And finally, clearcuts are what we think of when we think of forestry a lot, and that is the very extreme end of what we do as far as harvesting systems. And those clearcuts are creating lots and lots of exposed ground in order to allow for the regeneration of a whole new forest into the site. So you wouldn't see many of the original trees on the site, but we do have a requirement within clearcut systems to have 25 trees per hectare of various sizes and health conditions left on the site, purely for biodiversity and wildlife values. So clearcuts also used specific to, as a system, used specifically because of the type of forest and the ecology of the site. So we have primarily partial harvest systems, very few clearcuts, in fact, within the Muskoka and Parry Sound Forest. And of those partial harvest systems, it's a pretty even split between selection and shelterwood. And that's not to say conifers are managed with shelterwood, and selection is managed with tolerant hardwoods, but there is also shelterwood within tolerant hardwood forest, depending on the ecosystem. But we have primarily partial harvest systems. And now I'll delve into a little bit of the science and the ecology of forestry, just to get a better understanding of why we use these partial harvest systems, why we use clearcuts. And that is because of what's known as forest ecosystem dynamics, and the basic premise of sustainable forestry, which is trying to emulate nature and emulate what we see, what would happen naturally. And we can model that spatially and aspatially over that 150-year horizon to understand what those forest ecosystem dynamics are, and how these ecosystems change over time, specific to Muskoka. So it's important to note that forests are not static. We look at a forest, we take a photo of a lovely viewscape of the forest, and we think, how wonderful, this is like virgin forest, never changed. But it's actually very much changing all the time, and it's changed a lot since before European settlement, and it's changed throughout the millennia, as not only indigenous populations used the forest, but also, of course, with the receding glaciers and the changing forest types in the thousands of years after that. So forests aren't static, and one of the easiest ways to think about that is that trees are competing with each other, and that the death of individual trees is actually quite healthy and quite beneficial to forests. By having those trees die, by having the tops of those trees on the ground decomposing, we are adding nutrients, carbon, and diversity to that forest soil. And in many ways, people think of forests as moving linearly, whether it be for example, from a clear cut or from a fire event, where you have young juvenile trees entering into a site, growing up, competing with each other, some individuals winning, some of them losing, and then other species maybe more tolerant of shade growing up underneath, as we see from the stand initiation to the stem exclusion phase. And then you might see a canopy transition as those initial pioneer species, as they can be thought of, start to die out, either from old age or due to competition, and a transition to a forest with more shade-tolerant species or longer-lived species. And finally, once we have that established canopy of long-lived shade-tolerant species, there's small natural disturbances or small harvests that can occur that create these gap dynamics that basically maintain the same type of structure. But this kind of leads people into thinking that forests either are static once they get into the gap dynamic stage, or that this is a linear process, and that there is a climax forest or a climax ecology condition that we're working towards. And that's in fact not true. There is no such thing as a climax forest, and we could talk several lectures on that topic alone. But suffice to say that forest ecosystem dynamics are probably best represented aspatially with this, what's known as the adaptive cycle, where you have actual capital in the sense of the trees or the actual ecosystem itself growing, that capital being conserved, and then some sort of event, whether it's a natural disturbance or in the absence of natural disturbance, a harvest that releases that capital, reduces the connections between individuals within it, and causes a reorganization of the capital and the redevelopment of that growth. Now, this is a very abstract way of describing it. So a great way to think of Holling's adaptive cycle, which is described as a lazy 8 because none of this generally happens very quickly, unless you have a raging forest fire in which you can go from conservation to release very, very quickly. So it is described as a lazy 8 when it comes to forests and forest dynamics. But maybe an easier way of thinking about this is a spatial representation of what that looks like through computer modeling. And this really is what we model through as the natural disturbances that we emulate when we undertake harvest operations. So we have different forest conditions, different species on different sites with different soils and different vegetation, different species in the understory. And we're thinking, okay, if we have a harvest, and what kind of impact will that harvest have on the forest? Will it be a very intense, dramatic change to the forest, the way perhaps a major wind event or a catastrophic fire event or a tornado would affect that site? Or is it smaller in the sense of individual trees dying or pockets of trees dying due to disease or fungal pathogens? What type of condition are we dealing with, and what type of forest will that lead to naturally in the absence of harvest and in the absence of human influence? Because once again, we live in Muskoka, and there's no one's about to allow a raging forest fire to move through Muskoka. We're going to be protecting communities and infrastructure. So it's natural disturbances are not necessarily as natural as they could be in the absence because of the fact that we live in the area as people. So we use these harvest systems and harvesting practices to emulate natural disturbances, and so we can get to different types of forest conditions with those 3 different forest harvesting types. And what that is called is silviculture. All of that thinking, all of that aspatial and spatial design goes into the practice of silviculture, which is controlling the establishment, the growth, the composition, the health, and the quality of forests to not only emulate natural disturbances so that we can ensure that we are making sure that we are growing forests the way they would naturally be growing, but also to meet the diverse needs and values that we place on the forest. So we want to protect that heronry. A fire doesn't really care if there's a heronry in the way or not, but we want to protect that heronry. We believe that's an important value to protect, so we ensure that value is retained. And we also have economic and recreational and community-based values that we also need to consider and protect as well. So fundamentally, silviculture is a science and art of growing trees and tending forests based on the knowledge of the silvics, which is how trees grow, how individual species grow, and how they grow in association with each other. And like I said, we are constantly trying to emulate natural disturbances, and silviculture is not an exact science. It's both an art and a science. And so what we do with our forest operations prescription is create the conditions for a favorable outcome and increased probability of that forest achieving the type of forest condition that we both wanted to achieve because of all these ecological, cultural, and economic values, and that we needed to achieve in order to maintain both sustainability of the different of those values within the forest and the timber resource as well. And so to do that, we use evidence-based scientific direction, which is found in those guides. And we do that at a forest block by forest block basis by collecting data, analyzing that data, and developing the forest operations prescription. And that development of that forest operations prescription is done by a registered professional forester. So finally, those three types of systems, to go back to discussing the actual, what that looks like. We have clearcuts, which we call clearcuts with standard. And these are even-aged, shade-intolerant species that we utilize this type of silviculture system on, these clearcuts. And basically, we cut large sections of forest, create lots of open sunlight conditions, and either allow for natural regeneration or planting of the area to bring back the similar type of forest that was there originally, maintaining those 25 trees per hectare as a requirement for different wildlife and biodiversity objectives. So this is what that looks like in Muskoka when we talk about clear cuts. It looks stark initially from above before you have regeneration come in, but there's a forester in the foreground. He's not as tall as me, but he's probably almost 6 feet. And there's lots of regeneration of different species of maple. There's also lots of raspberry and rose and different herbaceous species as well that grow back into the area. And in this particular case, there is quite a few large mature trees within the immediate area. And spatially, it does vary across the block. So it's not as stark as one might think when you look at some photos, especially of Northern Ontario or Northern British Columbia, where it's a very different forest type, similar system, and similar regrowth underneath. But because we have these hardwood species mixed in with a lot of conifer species, we do have a very unique type of clear-cut systems. In saying that, we can also have clear-cuts where we have more park-like settings. So we have white pine trees that have economic potential within them, but they're being left specifically as seed trees to provide lots of natural regeneration onto the site. And the site itself is very sandy, very well drained, and doesn't promote the same amount of regeneration of herbaceous vegetation as in the previous site. And so that's why we see more of a park-like setting in this photo. So there's lots of natural regeneration that's going to be derived from those seed trees that are retained on the site, but there's also lots of planting that's going to be undertaken to bring this forest back to the type of white pine forest that it was originally, much like the white pine forest in the background. And that is, so the first type of partial harvest system I'll talk about is uniform shelterwood. And this is when we have species that are, as far as shade requirements go, would be an intermediate tolerance to shade. They don't handle full sunlight so well as other species, and so would be outcompeted in full sunlight conditions. And they can't grow very well in very shady conditions. So it wouldn't be appropriate to use a selection system in this type of partial harvest. A lot of those types of species would be white pine and red pine forests. We'd be using uniform shelterwood systems. We also use shelterwood with yellow birch and sugar maple as well, and this in a slight different variation. But the traditional textbook example is of a white pine dominated forest, where we're starting the system by thinning out the canopy, increasing the crowns of individual species, individual stems within the stand, and creating the conditions for regeneration on the site. And then that works through the prep cut, through to the seed cut. And now when you get to the first removal, there's already seedlings on the ground, and they're moving into saplings stages. And we're undertaking this first removal, which is reducing the canopy significantly and giving those saplings more sunlight. Now that they are a bit taller, a bit stronger, they can handle a little bit more sunlight, and we can promote their growth as the regeneration on site. And then finally, a final removal in the shelterwood system to make sure that we release that regeneration of white pine under these nursing white pine that are retained in the canopy. And once the final removal is complete, much like in the previous photo, really, we have these individual trees that are being left behind for wildlife factors, as nest trees, as seed trees in the future, and to give diversity to the site. So we don't just have an even cohort of young trees. So what that looks like on the ground, on the photo on the left, is this is the skid trail that went through the area, and individual trees have been taken out in this first removal. So there's still lots of trees left in the forest. The average person might not even realize there was a harvest here, but the reason that there is so many trees left behind, because we're providing that partial shade condition so that these juvenile white pine trees that are a couple meters tall now are able to continue growing. And the photo on the right is a great example of what very young white pine would look like in the area after that seeding cut stage of shelterwood. And of course, a big part of shelterwood systems is that there is the need for that additional help. So there is regeneration naturally, but we don't want to be just relying on natural regeneration. We want to bring seedlings sourced from the site. So there are seedlings sourced from that very same seed zone or adjacent seed zones, and plant those seedlings right into the site. And now, of course, with climate change, we are changing that to a degree and considering seedlings for further south or other seed zones in order to consider the future climatic condition that these seedlings are growing into, since we're planting 1 or 2 year old white pine seedlings and expect those trees to be 100, 150 years old in a very different climate. And finally, single tree selection is the most prevalent system that we use in Muskoka, and that is needed when we're dealing with species of trees and forest types that are shade tolerant and have a very uneven age system. And by uneven age, I mean there's individual trees within that forest stand that are young, maybe 10, 20 years old, that are 50, 60 years old, that are 100, 150 years old, maybe even 200 years old as well. So this diversity of ages, sizes, and species that can regenerate and do well as juvenile trees within shade do well with the single tree system. And what that means is that we remove up to 1/3 of the basal area, or a 1/3 of the amount of stems within the forest. And that's a very, very small harvest when you compare that to a shelterwood system or a clearcut system. It's a very, very small amount of timber that's extracted from the forest, comparatively speaking, but it's necessary to do that to ensure that the ecosystem itself continues to develop as it naturally would. These types of forests have a very thick layer of vegetation on the ground, as you can see in the middle photo. There's all the variation in sizes and ages. But on the photo on the left, where part of the harvest has already happened, you can see it's not a bare ground. There's lots of vegetation. The forest floor has a deep layer of leaves, and that prevents any significant fire event from happening. The fact that we have different species, different sizes, different tolerances to wind and insects and disease means that even small disturbance events that kill individuals or groups of individuals, the forest will continue to regenerate rather quickly because they're shade tolerant back into the same type of forest condition. And so that is what leads to us emulating natural disturbances in Muskoka in a large part through partial harvest and through the selection system specifically, because it's emulating that natural disturbance of these forests that are able to tolerate disturbances, small scale disturbances very well and recover from them very quickly. And the fact that large scale fires, large scale disturbances are exceedingly rare. I mean, a major forest fire event is expected every 400 years. according to the information, some of the information we have available to us. And I also wanted to point out the photo on the right, which is a hemlock forest. So not just hardwood forests or deciduous forests are managed with selection system. Hemlock, being a long-lived shade-tolerant species, is generally a forest of one species or very few other species associated with it. But you have individual trees of hemlock that are very large, very small, irrespective of their age, but you also have very young and very old trees within that forest as well. So it's not just hardwood forest, it's not just sugar maple and American beech that are managed with selection. There's a whole host of forest types. Species is one aspect of it, but the age class, the size class, and the way that those individuals regenerate are also critical components to deciding whether you apply a silviculture system such as selection. So that pretty much brings my presentation to an end, and thank you for listening. That's a photo of me in Vancouver, just east of Vancouver in Maple Ridge, where the research forest is, hugging a Douglas fir. I think it's about 600 years old. I'm a pretty tall person with like a 2-meter wingspan, and that thing is probably 4 meters in diameter. So in a patch of old growth forest, and Douglas fir does get up to 600 years old. Unfortunately, we don't have species that get quite that old in Muskoka. But if you go down to Milton and the Rattlesnake Point, you can see 1,000-plus-year-old cedars that are maybe 1.5 inches in diameter. So just wanted to highlight how a large tree is not necessarily old, and a small tree is not necessarily young either.